All right, welcome back to episode 3, Daniel chapter 3 and 333, just like 222.
333.
The same thing happened.
So this week we're going to be taking a look at Daniel and the image of gold in the fiery furnace. So chapter 3, verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So basically, he's bringing all these very important people together. And in chapter 4, the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do. O people, nations..."
Verse 4.
What'd I say?
Chapter 4.
Verse 4. Verse 4, then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound, you must worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." So this was another thing that King Nebuchadnezzar had expected the people to do to honor him. And we know, if we go out down to 3:12, but there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province that pay no attention to you, O king. And this would be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that they were known by their faith. And this goes back to what we have talked about in chapters 2 and also chapter 1, and that they are remaining faithful and that their faith is known all throughout Babylon and the kingdom.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And one really important point of this chapter that I glossed over, so apologize. Chapter 3, verse 10, the king issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. So we did talk about that. But what an additional thing that he had as an expectation that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace.
Yes, and I think this goes back to, will they remain faithful and hold to their convictions, or give in to what the king has decreed, what culture tells them they should follow? And in verse 17 and 18, they declare that the God whom we serve is able to deliver us, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, from the fiery furnace. He will deliver from your hand. But here's another but God, but if God does not, we will still not serve your gods. And I think this, we should probably ask the question, like, who is that, or what is that we worship? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they know the one whom they serve. They know his character and his heart. And faith is never easy. I mean, you're looking at a fiery furnace, you're looking at death. But it sure helps when you know the one whom you believe in.
That's right. And just to reiterate that, chapter 3, verse 16. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king." But as Zachary said, even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up.
So if you had to guess, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down to the idol. And so they were thrown into the fiery furnace. In fact, the king was so mad that he had it heated even hotter than it usually was, that his own men, as they were throwing them into the furnace, they died, they were burned up. And so as they should be scorching and yelling and screaming and dying in the furnace, verse 25, the king says, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt." The form of the fourth, because remember, it's just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so he sees another in the fire, is like the son of the gods.
Yeah, and so then in verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaps to his feet in amazement and asks his advisor, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" So it wasn't just a matter of throwing them in there. They were tied up. And they replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unharmed, unbound, and the fourth looks like the son of the gods." So again, we can see in this situation that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are there, and there's divine care, there's divine presence, and a divine deliverer, and that is what King Nebuchadnezzar sees. So what I'd like to highlight and talk a little bit about is let others see God in us, see God and Jesus in us in a time of trouble. I look at this situation and they're steadfast.
Yeah.
They seem to be courageous, but they also know that their God is going to save them.
Yeah, in verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar came down to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the midst of the fire. Verse 27 talks about the king's court came and saw that the fire had no power over them, not even the smell of smoke. So asking the question, like, what does great faith look like in this moment? It looks like following God in the secret moments, the little moments, the moments where no one sees you. You know, the goal isn't to get into the furnace, but to get into the heart of God. Every day, he was their goal. Just on that journey that they were on, it just so happened to lead to that furnace. All along, it was to go deeper with him, being God the Father, so that when trials and hardships come, they didn't have to pause and think whom they would serve. Not because of ignorance, but because they had already made up in their mind that decision to follow God long before that furnace was ever lit.
Yeah, and then you see, what did Nebuchadnezzar do? In verse 28, he recognizes that he recognizes what had been done and praises God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. So the king recognized their trust and the God that saved them, and he made a decree based on his own godly reverence that he saw in what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went through. And in verse 29, therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And so this divine deliverance, I guess if you would call it that, from God that protected them, also gave them favor with the king, a king who was not a God follower, but he had seen God in action before. We had talked about it in verse 1 and in verse 2, and here's another example of what God did in these situations. We think about their steadfast faith, their steadfast courage, their steadfastness in trusting in God. They put their trust and their faith in what he could do, not versus what he would do. Just as we talked about earlier, not based on anything God can do, but just because he's God, trusting in him.
Mm-hmm. He's able, but even if he doesn't, the goal isn't to get out of the fire. The goal is just to be with him in the fire, through the fire, or out of the fire. That was their goal all along.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we were talking about kind of doing that heart check, as we're going through the pandemic, as we're going through such crucial times right now in the history of the world, basically, when we're looking to the world to get us out of things, when we're looking to government to get us out of things, when we're looking to everything but God.
Yeah, what are we looking to in this season, in this moment? Kind of what we talked about in the last episode is, what is our focus on? Like, what is it, the culture or what's happening around us? Or, as the fire is coming closer and closer to us in this season, are we going to move closer and closer to God, or to fear, worry, dilemma, angst?
Yeah, heart check. I like that. Heart check would be, think about that. Think about where you're at right now and what God is revealing to you through this word. And if there's anything that you feel like you've been relying on a little bit too much lately in the world, and think about putting your trust in God. Think about putting your faith in God and really digging deep into the word. Daniel is just one book of the Bible that we wanted to go through because we wanted to talk about faithfulness and trust. But there are so many other good books in the Bible to read if you want to really dig into what God's faithfulness to us. John is a great book to read. I would recommend that, encourage that. Is there anything you'd recommend, Zachy?
No, John. Start with John.
Start with John.
See where that ends up. And even if you're not a Jesus follower and you're listening to this and you're thinking, what's the point of actually following God and following Jesus and going after this and living out the faith? As you can see in the past few weeks, like everything that the world was built on has just really crumbled and come to a stop. And yet we have a faith that has roots 4,000 years old, and it got renewed with Jesus about 2,000 years ago, and it will last until eternity. Like the track record for the faith is good. And so putting your faith and trust in Jesus in this season, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, and I just want to add, we talked about this at the beginning in episode 1, but one of the things that we really want to rely on here at Camp Chat is to rely on Matthew 7. Matthew, the book of Matthew in chapter 7, verse 7 through 8. Zach made a comment that, even if you're not a Christ follower and you just maybe don't really know, you want to check some things out. That verse is really important for us because it is what we would expect in any new situation, where it talks about ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks it will be opened. And one of the things that I used to say to Zach and his brother when they were younger is, God doesn't always give us everything we want, but he does always give us everything we need. And when you really dig into his word and you ask and you seek and you find, God's gonna give you wisdom and discernment and direction.
Yeah, we serve a God who's not dead, and sometimes I think we forget that.
Amen.
All right, episode 3. Stay safe. Stay
Amen.
social distancing.
Be blessed and be a blessing.
Bye.
Bye-bye.